on the mount already. It's pretty easy to have it hooked up to a fuel tank. 2 bolts hold it down. You need the 9/16 wrench to get it loose. And the first thing you're going to have to do is slide the engine forward so you can loosen the drive belt. Once it's all the way forward, pretty simple process. You're going to pull the belt over the wheel, and you're going to disconnect any leads that are still in place. Different models have different connections, so check your manuals, of course. That's all available in the J&J manual. Make sure everything's disconnected, and then once your belt is loosened, you crank it the other way to actually remove the engine. Well, once you've got the belt snug, it's time to talk about belt alignment. First, make sure the grooves are locked in by actually turning the wheel forward. Now you're ready to check your deflection. You want to have about a 1/4 inch of deflection on the belt, and obviously you do that with the ruler. That is just about right there. Remember, if you're over tight on this, you're going to do some damage to the bearing. It's going to wear them out a little faster. And if it's loose, think it'd fly right off. Talk about your unscheduled maintenance, you'll get some right there. It's time to retighten the lockdowns now on the engine mount. Please check your J&J manual for the proper torque there. We're also going to do one more thing, and that is eyeball the alignment between the drive pulley and the driven pulley. And you're going to do that with a straight edge. You're going to eyeball it from the back to the front and make sure it is on a straight line. And finally, you're going to reconnect any leads you might have had to pull, whether it's at this end or into the fuel tank and the fuel tank filter. Now let's move along to adjusting the throttle. One big safety tip when you're doing this, get the cart up off the ground. This is another reason it's great to have a lift in your shop. You can do all you want with the throttle and you don't have to worry about a runaway. Here is the throttle arm on these babies, and how fast the cart can go at maximum is determined by this little bolt right here. If you tighten it up, more play, cart goes faster. If you loosen it, less play, cart cannot go as fast. There's 2 ways to determine the RPMs of the Honda engine. Of course, the wireless tach is a tried and true method, but even better is a digital MPH gauge. That takes the reading right off the tire and gives you the true speed. Now, the factory setting on these engines is 3,600 RPMs. Here at the Family Fun Center, that translates to 17 miles an hour. But remember, each track is different, and a local operator should decide what the appropriate safe speed is and set your RPMs accordingly. Remember, in some of the J&J models, there is a cable drive, so be sure to consult your workshop manuals for the exact specs. All right, now we're down to my favorite part, wheels. We got 5-inch wheels on these babies, and they use the very durable Bigfoot tires made for concession use. Now, the life of the tires can really vary, 2 to 8 weeks, 100 to 1,000 hours. It's all about track conditions. It depends on if you're running on concrete or asphalt, and frankly, how much you run the tires. You got to keep an eye on them. And the biggest thing is air pressure. You want to inflate to 35 to 55 psi. Factory setting is 45, but again, local conditions will really determine things. How do you know when to change them? Well, obviously, any bulges or uneven wear is a sure sign, and when you're down to that white wear strip, it's definitely time to make a change. But even if you're not ready to change them, check the wear. If it's uneven across the tire, you probably need to rotate them. It's a good idea. You get more life out of each tire. Always rotate from the most worn side to the least worn side, and vice versa. As far as removing the tires, very simple. You have 4 lug nuts you have to remove. Don't mess with the hub right now. Don't mess with these bolts. Just remove the 4 lug nuts and pull straight out. I suppose this is as good a time as any for one of those safety reminders. This is one of those drills where it's really good to have the safety goggles on of some sort in the shop. Before you do anything with removing the rims, get the valve stem out and deflate the tire before you do anything about the rim. It's a 2-piece rim on these wheels. There's 4 bolts, so this is where these bolts now come into play. Once you've removed the first part of the rim, make sure you clear the valve stem, and then you're going to inspect your inner tube. You're not always replacing it, but this is a good time to check for signs of wear, any chafing or pinching. This tube's in good shape, so I'm going to put it back in and put my rim back on. Now when you put the rim back on, the tire is going to be inflated to 45 psi. That's your factory specs. You may do it a little different once you get the karts out on the track. And you're going to want to use the proper torque recommended in the manual for putting the two pieces of the rim back together. Finally, when you put the wheel back on the car, always remember it's the tapered side of the lug nut that goes in first. Checking the floater hub and the axle bearings is something that will come up quite a bit on your 100-hour checkups. Start with the floater hub. The inner nut here needs to be tightened properly with a torque wrench. Always check your manual for the proper torque. Now let's talk about the hub itself. There's sealed bearings here, so all you have to do is make sure that the hub will turn very freely. And as you can see, it's just right here. Then you want to check to make sure your brake rotor is aligned with the top of the caliper. We'll move the throttle back here, get a good look at that. Now you notice we've taken the brake pads out here. This lets you check the axle bearings. You want to see if you can lift them a little bit, and if there's any play at all here, you probably got a problem. So give it a little reef and just see if it's moving. It's not, so that's a good sign. We got 3 bearings to look at here, and there's a total of 6 set screws. This is really important. Every 100 hours, make sure they're tight and make sure they're locked down using red Loctite. If this gets loose, you could have a lot of problems. You're going to damage the axle. 120 bucks maybe to replace one of these, plus new bearings. So this is definitely a penny-wise, pound-foolish test. And finally, you want to grease your bearings. You want to do that every other of your weekly checks, or roughly every 200 hours. Hey, let's move along to the brake rotor that is actually attached to the hub. Again, you want to make sure it is aligned properly, lined up right in the middle of the caliper. You want to make sure that the pinch bolt, which is right in here, is tight and torqued properly. And again, you're going to refer to your workshop manual for the proper torque. You're going to check the bolts that actually hold the rotor to the hub, make sure they're secure. You want to look at the locking screw. That's this little guy right here, and you want to make sure that the keyway itself is in place. Make sure your bolts are locked in with red Loctite, and always check this whole thing every week. That is, again, part of your 100-hour service. You know, your basic J&J kart is one-wheel drive. That means there's a double caliper right here for the brakes. And the calipers mount using 2 bolts to the frame. Always adjust your torque according to the manual. As far as removing the pads, it's very simple. You take out your retainer pin and pull the pad. You always want to check the wear groove in the brake pad. When there's no more groove, time to change the pad. It's that simple. Inspecting the brake line, you're looking for dripping brake fluid, and a sure sign of that is if you have little dots on the frame, sometimes little clumps of dirt, because you know it's just like oil on the floor of the garage, it sticks to the fluid. Brake fluid, of course, goes through the brake line here. You have one fitting going into the master cylinder. You're going to check this one for leaks, and then the line runs all the way through the tube frame to the back end and to the calipers. You've got 3 fittings to look at here. Again, you're checking for leaks, and also the bleeder valve. This is a spot you can get a leak as well. If you have to tighten up your fittings, use your basic 9/16" wrench to do the job. Now, the stainless steel braided lines we use here at J&J are very effective because they do resist chafing and are less prone to leaks. Hey, you know, brakes are probably one of your most important, if not the most important, safety systems on the kart. Now, once a year, you're going to completely flush the system, but you're always going to be checking your fluid levels, usually once a week during your 100-hour check. You got to pop the old master cylinder and check the levels. You want your fluid to be about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch from the top of the cylinder. If it drops below the halfway point, you're probably getting air lines, and it's time to bleed the system anyway. Always use good old .3 brake fluid. And when you're done, make sure your gasket is all neat and clean, lined up straight. Don't want to leak from that. And put the cap back on your master cylinder. Now, eventually you're going to have to bleed the lines. It's a given fact. You get some air in there one way or another. It's a 2-man job to bleed the brakes. One of you is going to be up front here pushing down on the pedal from the beginning. And usually you'll know when it's time to bleed the brakes because someone's been complaining that the brakes are kind of spongy in the first place. Your partner is going to be here in the back on the release valve, letting the fluid out. So it starts with the pedal all the way to the floor. Open the release valve, and you'll have fluid and probably some air popping along with it. coming into your drainage cup here. Once the pedal gets all the way to the floor, you're going to close the valve here in the back and then repeat the process until you get a hard, firm brake pedal in the front. You'll also know you're done when it is all fluid coming through the hose and no air popping its way through there. And please, always remember to dispose of the used fluid properly. You want to be nice to Mother Nature. Hey, before we go, I want to go back to the back end of the cart one more time here. I got a couple of things to show you. We're going to start with the drive pulley. Pretty easy to remove. The nut is attached to the outside washer, and the pulley itself and the keyway slide right out. Now, the reason you might be going in here is to replace this seal. Honda puts a perfectly good rubber seal here on the transmission, but at J&J, we've got a new one in the catalog made of Biton high-temperature rubber. It can really handle the heat these transmissions put